On this episode of Visual Studio Toolbox, we're going to kick off our Get Started with GitHub series, and we're going to see how to create a project in Visual Studio and then create a GitHub repository from it. Hi, welcome to Visual Studio Toolbox. I'm your host, Robert Green, and this episode kicks off our 5-part mini-series on getting started with GitHub. We're going to see how we can put our code into source control and use GitHub to do that. So a prerequisite, of course, is that you have a GitHub account. So here's mine, github.com/rogreen. I've got some private repositories, which are just my code. I've got some public repositories, which I'm sharing with others. And I've also shared the demo script I'm going to use throughout these episodes in a nice little Word doc there. So if you want to follow along later on, you can certainly do that. So the first prerequisite is that you have a GitHub account. They're free and that you've signed into it. The second prerequisite is that you have Git for Windows installed locally. The easiest way to do that is do it as part of your Visual Studio install. Either when you install Visual Studio or after the fact, you can come in and modify your installation, go to the individual components tab, search for Git, and just make sure that you've got Git for Windows checked, and then install that. What that will do is install Git locally and wire up Visual Studio to work with GitHub. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is create some very easy code that we're going to use for our demo. So I'm just going to create a simple console application because I want to keep the code simple. Okay, and while this is being created, let's talk a little bit about why you want to use source control in the first place. Well, one good reason is it becomes your backup of your code. So let's say you're working on a project and your hard drive crashes. Have you lost everything? Well, if you're using source control and you've copied all of your code up into a server repository like GitHub, then you don't necessarily lose anything. The only thing you'd lose is any changes that you'd made since the last time you pushed your version of the code up into the server. Also makes it very easy to work on multiple machines. So you work on some code at work, and then you want to work on it at home on a different computer. In the old days, you'd put all the code on a jump drive and you'd copy it from machine to machine. A much better way to do it is to put all that code up in GitHub. And then when you come home, you can clone or download the code to your local machine. We'll see how to do that later on. So it's great for working on multiple machines, whether it's work and home, or maybe you're working on a Maui project. You want to open it in Visual Studio on Windows and also open it in Visual Studio for Mac. What you can do is on one machine, push that code up, and on the other machine, clone or bring the code down. It also makes it great for multiple developers. So you may not be the only person working on the project. If a number of people are working, you got to have one central location for the code. That's what GitHub can do. And finally, it's a great way to share code. So if we go back to my repository, here's code that I've shared. These were talks I gave at conferences. I make the code public, and then anybody can see that code. This is also a great way for the product teams to share samples. So if you're looking for a Maui samples or Blazor samples or whatever, they're typically all in GitHub. Okay, so here's our console project. And now what we want to do is add it to source control. A number of ways we can do this. We can right-click on the solution and create a Git repository. We can go to the Git menu and create a Git repository. We can come down in the lower right here in the status bar, click Add to Source Control and choose Git. All three of these will bring up the Create a Git Repository dialog. Okay, so the first thing we can decide is, are we using GitHub? We can also use Azure DevOps. So Git is plumbing, and Visual Studio uses the Git plumbing to work with a remote repository. Could be GitHub, works just as great with Azure DevOps. We're going to choose GitHub for our purposes here. Where's the code? Well, it's obviously the project we were just working with. Do we want a Git ignore template? We do. That's a list of files that we don't want added to source control. We'll look at that after we create the repository, or repo, as it's known. Do you need a license? If you're the only one working with the code, you don't necessarily need a license. If you're sharing it with others, I think you want one. The MIT license is popular because it's nice and short. Let's add a README. I've already signed into GitHub. The repository name defaults to the name of the project. You can keep that. You can use something more descriptive, up to you. You can enter a description. So Visual Studio Toolbox. This is actually the code for Visual Studio Toolbox GitHub miniseries. And then do I want to make it a private or public repository? As we mentioned, if you're the only one who is going to be able to look at the code, keep it private. If you want other people to be able to look at it, make it public. And now at this point, I'm going to click Create and Push. And what Visual Studio does is it uses the Git commands behind the scenes to tell GitHub to create this repository. It doesn't take too long. Of course, the amount of code you have will determine how long it takes. It's done. So now we can pop over to GitHub, look at my repositories, and here it is, Console App 1. It's private. Here's the description I added for it. If we go and look at it, we can see that it has not only the code, but a bunch of additional files like Git attributes and the Git ignore. The Git ignore are the files that are not going to be copied into source control, user files, temporary files, build results. None of that's source code. The only thing we want in GitHub is the actual code. Okay, here's the license. We use the MIT license, nice and short and simple. And we said there's a README. Now the README is currently empty. We can make a change to that. You can actually change code right in GitHub, and we're going to do a lot of that in these episodes just to keep things simple. If you're updating the README, nothing wrong with doing it in GitHub. It's the easiest way. This is the README, so README. Let's commit the changes. And the commit message in GitHub defaults to update file. The extended description could be additional information, added text to the README. Let's commit the changes directly to the master branch. The master or main branch is, you can think of that as the official or production version of the code. Okay, so now we've seen that in GitHub, we've created a repository or repo. What did we create locally? Because one of the things about GitHub is you have both a remote repository, which is what's sitting up on GitHub, and a local repository, which is sitting on your machine. So where did that go? Well, if we go to Git Open in File Explorer, we can see. There it is. So in the console1 folder is the actual code from Visual Studio. And then there's also this .git folder, which contains a local version of the repository. So when I'm working with code, I'm going to be working locally. And then when I'm ready to send those changes up to GitHub, I'll do what's known as a push and copy everything up to GitHub. So this Git folder contains the entire history of the project, everything that's been committed, everything that's in the repository, in the remote repository, gets copied locally, which means I can work on this without having to be connected and then connect and push changes up. Here's the Git ignore, here's the license. So here's the README. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to open it. Let's open it with Notepad. Hey, wait a minute. This is the old version of the README. I thought we made changes up in GitHub. Well, this is one of the very important things to remember about this. You make a change and push it to the remote repo in GitHub, it doesn't automatically come down to your local machine. We made the change in GitHub or on a different machine. My machine's not automatically going to get those changes. I have to go and ask for them. And the way I do that is to do a pull. So I'm going to go to Git and pull, and what that will do is copy down the server version or the remote version of the current branch, which is master. And now when I look at the README, now I have the latest version. Okay, what else can we do in here? We can always go and look at the branch history. So I'm going to view branch history, and here's what happened. Robert, which is me locally on my machine, created the repository in Visual Studio and pushed it up. And then me on the server, Robert Green, made a change. So I can see changes that I made. I can see changes that other people made. And if I double click on this change here, then I can see that this went from having no code or no text to having some text. You can look at inline, you can look at side by side. So this is what it looked like originally, and this is what it looked like after somebody made a change. Okay, so we've created the project, we've pushed it up into GitHub and created a repository, and that's awesome. Now, I said earlier that one of the benefits of using GitHub for source control is it makes it easy to work on multiple machines. So this repository now exists. How would I use it on another computer? Let's go to Git and clone repository, and now I need to put in a URL. Where's that URL? Well, let's go to GitHub. Let's go to the main page. And if I click code, here's the URL that I would use to clone. I can also from here open in GitHub Desktop. I can open it directly in Visual Studio. But since we're in Visual Studio to begin with, I'll just copy this, paste it back into Visual Studio. Now, I already have a console app 1 on this computer, so it's not going to create 2 of them. So let's just call this console app 1 backup. And now I'm going to bring this down locally. Okay, and let's open this project, console app backup. And if I open in File Explorer, notice that I now have this copied locally, and I have the full repository and all the files. So this is the one I created, and this is the one I cloned. So in real life, on a different machine, you would clone console app 1, but for our purposes here, I cloned it as backup. So that's how you can take an existing repository and start using it on another machine. So what we've seen in this episode is that you can create a project in Visual Studio, create a GitHub repository from it, push the code up, and we've started to see how you can make changes to that code and manage that. We've also seen how you can clone an existing repository to use it on a different computer or a different version of Visual Studio Mac, Visual Studio Code, whatever. So if you're watching on YouTube and you like this, please like, share with your friends, and join us for the next episode where we'll actually start making some changes to code. We will see you next time on Visual Studio Toolbox.